Ladies and gentlemen, hello, my name is Shovik Nag from the Indo-Canadian Business Chamber. I welcome you all on behalf of Ms. Nadira Hamid, who is the Chief Executive Officer. The Chamber is a premier organization in India for trade and investments in the India-Canada Economic Corridor. Tonight's session is on the National Education Policy 2020, recently announced by the Government of India. We have with us prominent panelists, Dr. V. Raghunathan, Dr. Barry Craig, Dr. Dishan Kamdar for the interaction. Moderating this session is Mr. Rontu Basu, past president of the Chamber, current national director at ICBC Maharashtra Regional Council, and co-founder at Quest Partners. While the panel discussion is underway, we would request and encourage the audience members to please post their questions on the chat box. I now welcome and request Rontu Basu to take the session forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Shovik. Welcome everyone to our webinar on the National Education Policy. Good evening to those who have joined us in India, and good morning to our friends from Canada. This 66-page NEP document provides a forward-looking framework for transforming Indian education and has already generated a lot of discussion and debate. In fact, last week, I think the Prime Minister Modi mentioned it 2 or 3 times in different remarks at different forums. In structural terms, the NEP sees measures to introduce early childhood education from the age of 5, moving away from rote learning, reintroducing the 4-year undergraduate degree program, and setting up the national commission for the new overarching regulator is important steps which this policy document has taken. So the question is, does the new policy merit 3 cheers or 1.5 cheers? As Gursharan Das, a noted author and commentator, recently mentioned in an op-ed in Times of India. Will it be the key to unlock better learnings and make India a knowledge hub? The devil, as we all know, lies in the implementation. And what is the roadmap in this regard? To discuss all this, I'm joined by an eminent panel of academicians from India and Canada. We have Dr. Barry Craig, the visionary president of Huron at Western University, one of Canada's oldest liberal arts universities, set up in 1863. Barry, from my interactions with him, is truly a leader with heart and embodies Huron's tagline of leadership with heart. Dr. Dishan Kamdar is the highly accomplished Vice Chancellor of FLAME, a pioneering liberal arts institution in India located near Pune. The FLAME website lists 55 reasons to join FLAME. I think they missed out on the most important reason, which should be reason 56, and that is Dr. Kamdar, a favorite professor to all his students. And last but not least, my dear friend, Dr. Raghunathan, more popularly known as Raghu, director of the India campus at the Schulich School of Business, former professor of finance at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, prolific author and columnist, and also, very interestingly, has the most varied collection of antique clocks dating back centuries. So if any of you have a mechanical padlock that requires a complex mathematical formula to unlock, I can assure you Raghu will unlock it in a jiffy. And not to mention, Barry, one of Raghu's books, The Good Indian Guide to Queue Jumping, is a must read for you before you make your next trip to India. So let's jump into the webinar and begin with short opening remarks by our panelists before we proceed to discussions with questions. We will leave sufficient time for audience questions, so please put it down in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. So let's start with Dr. Kamdar. Sure.
Sure, Rontu. You talk about 3 cheers, 1.5 cheers to the NEP, keeping aside implementation that is yet to unfold. But on the surface, the national education policy, in my opinion, I think deserves five thumbs up from in my opinion at least. And amongst the major reforms suggested, I am extremely excited about two very important revolutions. In my view, the entire approach towards multidisciplinary education deserves, a huge thumbs up. And also the setting aside of the national NRF, right, the National Foundation for Research. If I think India, all these years, we have been taking along the left behind legacy of the British in our very linear approach towards education. We have over the years created super specialists, right? And we are in the, we are in a digital age today. We are in the 21st century today. And I think there is a need for education to impart, domain expertise, but with domain expertise, lots of transferable skills, right? If you want your students, your leaders to do well in the 21st century, you need, over and above being a functional expertise. I mean, think about an engineer not knowing design in this time and age, right? Infosys, for example, has been hiring engineers all this time. They've stopped hiring engineers. They're starting to hire designers, and they're getting them to work together. This is a time in this 21st century where multidisciplinary approach towards education, towards work, is warranted. Think about a doctor not understanding psychology, not having the empathy towards patients. I mean, not understanding IT, right? So I think this is extremely celebrated, and the entire holistic approach towards education, which this policy will unfold, will bring in entrepreneurship and innovation in our country, right? Just think about a student in the 21st century going through this reforms, right? They will acquire soft skills like critical thinking, right? The ability to connect across dots, right? The ability to work with teams, to be innovative. This is a critical need, right? You ask any CSO and CXO, any C-level, leader, what is the first thing that you are looking out for when you hire someone, right? Innovation is the first word that will come up, right, in this digital age. So with linear education, right, we will not be able to impart the 21st century skills, and that has been a big lacuna. So I am very excited.
Thank you, Dishan. Barry, your opening remarks?
Yeah, I'd second Dishan's motion. I think it's a really visionary document. So much so that I was copying excerpts from it and sending out to some of our stakeholders, board members, and members of my leadership team. What's remarkable about it is, I think, the breadth of the vision. And I'll just speak about the section, of course, on post-secondary education. That's our focus today. The notion of post-secondary education as having a value in civil society is something that we don't talk enough about, certainly in North America or in Europe. We primarily speak about education as a private good, and that's how governments and corporations are interested. We go to young people and we say, if you get an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree, you'll get a good job and you'll make money. But I think some of us have an awareness that there's a higher role for post-secondary education, and that is strengthening, constructing in some cases, but certainly strengthening the fabric of civil society. And if you read the language in the NEP, there's a lot of that language that's about this. Creating citizens who have a sense of responsibility for one another, who have a sense of justice, a sense of ethical purpose, and that you would think about this in constructing a national education policy is, I think, a remarkable thing. The second thing, of course, I would applaud Dishan's pointed to, and that's this recognition of the value of a certain kind of education, which Flame University and here on my institution are all about, which is liberal education. And that's giving students a breadth of understanding that is multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And 30 years ago, this was not part of the discourse in Western universities, and now it is. We moved for decades towards ever increasing siloization of students, where the specialization was increasingly narrow, and it was all about depth and not breadth. And now I think we recognize, in the examples that Dishan mentioned, the value of having breadth. So the example I use when I'm speaking to prospective students, parents, and government now is our current situation with respect to COVID. Yes, there's a scientific and technical element to this crisis, but there's monetary and fiscal element to it, and there's an enormous social element to it. And working our way through this particular crisis involves questions of justice, equity, access, as much as questions about vaccines and social distancing. And so many of the issues we're dealing with around the world today have as much of a social aspect as they do of technological aspect. And so if we're going to respond as modern universities, then we have to be able to incorporate those kinds of perspectives along with all of the others. Now, there are obviously some tensions and challenges in the NEP. One simple one is that you're going to create an overarching, centralized bureaucratic environment, while at the same time, the document talks about increased autonomy to institutions. And how you will be able to reconcile those two things will be one of the challenges. And then, of course, the timeline is tremendously ambitious. So within 20 years, by 2040, we'll have constructed an entirely new educational system, transformed universities, created new institutions, devised new curricula. And that is, I think, a very aggressive and optimistic timeline. Having said that, I think the vision set out in the document, again, I agree with Dishan, 5 stars.
Thank you, Barry. So Dishan mentioned a holistic approach, a multidisciplinary ambit to it. Barry, you've talked about strengthening civil society. Raghu, what are your thoughts on overview of the document?
Having heard both Dishan and Barry, I think my job is much easier. I could just say ditto to both and stop it right there. Because purely as a document, as both of them have rightly said, the document is visionary, is a great policy document. It lays down the philosophy of education as what it should be as compared to what it has been all these years. And I think all of that is absolutely right. And there's no questioning. In fact, anything that one says in criticism will be a spoiler for the simple reason it's an excellent document and there are no two ways about it. But it'll be very boring to leave it at that. So I'm going to also take a slightly flip side of certain things, which is that India is full of great economists, even if our economy may not be in the greatest of shapes. It's the same with this document. It's a great document, which is not to say that great documents will automatically lead to great educational foundation. Because a second-rate documentation implemented very well is better than a top strategic documentation implemented abysmally. And I think that's our problem. For example, I tried to look at the NEP of 1986 today to see what percentage of those goals of NEP 1986 had been achieved till today. And to my surprise, not only is that information not available anywhere, but I would have expected the new national education policy to start from there. That this was the last policy, these have been the achievements, or these have not been achieved, and now we are trying to take it to the next level or something. Now, the absence of that is scary, not because the past has not been addressed, but to me, it also shows the mindset of the lack of accountability. See, any document which ends, for example, this document talks about ending in 2040. And many of the landmarks are in 2035 and beyond. So when you have something to happen 15 years, 20 years later, the accountability doesn't come out very clearly. And the documentation is a little weak on setting the trend in that direction. So that is my main concern in terms of, we have talked about Make in India, we have talked about Clean India and so on. So yes, we have very good intentions, but our ability to really put things in place will be tested to the limits now. And I think it is for the educational sector, both in the private and the public domain, to live up to the spirit of this document. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Raghu. So if I can now turn to Barry. So one of the path-breaking moves in this document was the setting up or facilitating the entry of foreign universities into India. Huron has looked at India very closely, has been active in recruitment and doing programs here. So what are your thoughts, sort of medium to long term? Would Huron ever take that route? And if I could sort of expand that question to what do you think of other Canadian universities? What would be their thinking on this particular bit in the document?
Yeah, India is a very exciting place for us. We've only been involved in the Indian market for a little over 2 years. And this fall, Indian students will be the single largest cohort of international students in Huron, surpassing the students from China that we've been engaged in for decades. And so not only that, the students are outstanding. They take a leadership role on campus, academically very good. So it's a market we want to continue to grow. But there are two things I would say. First, with respect to a specific item in the policy, the notion of the top 100 universities or top 200, I'm one of the people that you can say completely as a skeptic about these kinds of world rankings. Some of the very best undergraduate universities in the world, and I can name all kinds of American ones if I just step back from our Canadian landscape, wouldn't be included in those rankings. And if you're serious in the new divisions that they're constructing, research universities, teaching universities, and so on, if you're really serious about undergraduate education, the top 100 research universities, quite frankly, aren't always the best at undergraduate education, and they tend to dominate the world rankings. So I would send one of my kids to Flame any day over sending them to the University of Toronto for an undergraduate education, because that specialization is different. So that's one thing I would say. An asterisk about limiting participation to the top 100. Second thing is, if we're going to get involved in India, about a year ago I spoke to an ICBC event in Delhi, and I talked about not repeating colonization and having colonization 2.0. If we're going to be involved in India, I would much rather partner with Flame than come in full of arrogance and hubris and claim that I'm going to set up a university in an ancient culture and tell them things that they don't know. Why would I not participate with somebody who knows the culture, understands it, and can teach me things that I don't know, and work in a meaningful partnership? That, to me, is a much better way forward than what some institutions perhaps are envisioning.
Thank you, Barry. That's interesting to hear from you. So if I can sort of flip it now to Dishan, this document also allows elite or select Indian universities to look at setting up offshore campuses. So what's your thoughts on that regard in terms of would there be a gold rush, or will a lot of universities be interested, and what sort of destinations?
Sure. I think that's an interesting question, but I would like to comment on Barry's point here. While the government has outlined an ambitious wish list of inviting top schools, right? But will this really happen, right? When we open our doors and invite top schools to set up shops, universities in India, would they continue to consider the partnership module, right, path, or a, as Barry, pointed out, standalone competing with Indian institutions in India. While the intent is there, I'm not too sure whether, foreign universities would actually, take this step and come over to India and set up, brick and mortar institutions out here, right? That's my first take. And with respect to Indian institutions setting up, in offshore locations, I think we need to up our research rigor first in this country, right? One thing is for me to be ambitious, or for institutions to be ambitious to set up offshore, to set up institutions in different locations, but acceptability and competing in those locations and being successful there is another question, right? So if you look at the state of our research rigor, research productivity, it's unfortunately not there, right? And that's why I had mentioned in my introductory remark that the second thing that really excites me about the national education policy is the fact that it's given research. Research is at a central piece, especially in the higher education space, right? So I do see more partnerships happening rather than we setting up, our institutes offshore or institutes coming over to India. I foresee deeper engagement between, Indian HEIs and partners overseas. Engagement would be, deeper exploration with respect to faculty exchange in terms of research, faculty exchange, teaching, right? Enhancing student exchange programs with more breadth, with many more schools, with deeper engagement. I see that happening rather than setting brick and mortar institutions.
Thank you, Dishan. And following up on that point, Raghu, I think I did read somewhere the education secretary saying it's not so much as foreign universities coming up as setting up campuses. They're looking more at the twinning model continuing and that getting more steam. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, in fact, the document itself has not elaborated anything further beyond the intent of attracting foreign universities. For example, the Indian Foreign Universities Bill, which was initiated more than a decade ago, never saw the light of the day, and nor has this government even now, even in this document, given any dateline as to when such a bill could be tabled in the parliament again. And they have said actually, and the education secretary did make an explicit statement in an interview that they are looking at the twinning programs under the All India Council of Technical Education's current guidelines. In fact, Shulik's presence in India is under precisely those guidelines. In other words, what this means is, in the short term, in the next 1 or 2 year time frame, nothing is likely to change significantly. Significantly, things could change only when the foreign university bill gets passed. Until then, it is twinning. There are already 3 or 4 twinning programs happening in India. Some are official with proper approvals, and some are under the radar. And there was always a wink-wink kind of arrangement possible in our kind of a context. But I agree with Dishan that even if it were to be fully opened up, I do not see a cascade of foreign universities coming with investments in brick and mortar, because they are all wary of investing in India for various reasons. I remember when before Shulik came in, when we were shopping for partners, MIT wanted us to put in a corpus of $100 million. Now, the question is, what were they going to bring to the table? And this is when they expected the foreign university bill was just around the corner, when Mr. Kapil Sibal was the HRD minister at that time. So I think Dishan is right in saying that, yes, much of the way forward is more likely to be in terms of more healthy, more open relationships. Even the AICTE thing today is extremely constrained. For everything, if you increase the number of students from X to Y, you have to run to the AICTE for permission. You want to take in foreign students, you have to run for permission. You want to add one more course, you have to add 20,000 square feet extra on the space. So, it's not going to be very easy, even if it opens up tomorrow, but there are no thoughts of opening it up in the next couple of years. That's my reading.
Thank you, Raghu. Quickly following up on that, Barry, I mean, just curious to know, in case Indian institutions like Flame, for example, were to want to set up in a place like Canada, what are Canadian rules and regulations for allowing international universities to come in? Do they at all allow that? Because we often criticize India for being so restrictive, but what's the Canadian position?
Well, as you know, Rantu, education in Canada constitutionally is provincial jurisdiction and not federal. And so for that reason, we don't have a national policy on post-secondary. And so regulations vary from province to province. In fact, there are already some foreign institutions. I think Fairleigh Dickinson University was one of the very first to come to Canada. Northeastern University has 2 outposts in Canada. And so there are already some of these. And so some provinces are more welcoming than others. In truth, Canada is quite well served in terms, in my opinion, of the number of universities compared to the density of our population. And so there's not a demand in Canada for dozens more universities. Having said that, what we're now seeing in Canada in the last 2 or 3 years, and there are more on the way, are private institutions. Almost all of our universities are publicly funded, but we're now seeing a movement towards more private institutions come forward. There are 2 or 3 currently in the hopper now in different areas, and sort of a toe in the water. And that, again, I think will be an interesting part of the next decade or so in India under the NEP, to see the degree to which private institutions are able to pivot more quickly than public institutions. Certainly one of the things with public institutions is extra layers of bureaucracy and regulation. It slows down decision making, and the ability to pivot quickly is more difficult. That's intentional in some ways because it's a safeguard against doing imprudent things. On the other hand, when you want to modernize or change quickly, it can be easier for a private institution than public. So as India moves forward, and this document allows for both tracks, public and private, it will be interesting to see if the private institutions are more quickly able to adapt than public institutions. And if the government is serious about implementing this, it's going to have to pour an awful lot of money into public institutions to get them to where it wants to see them at the same time.
Okay. Dishan, you touched in your remarks about the NEP talking about this national research fund to promote R&D, and that's a big part of the document. So you're optimistic that that will enable and bolster a much needed culture of research in Indian universities, which has been lacking in the past?
Well, absolutely. But I think we need to look at how much of independence the NRF is given, right? One is to set up the NRF, but how much of autonomy, how much of independence is given to NRF for them to be able to, catalyze this entire movement in terms of research in India. And also the coordination between the National Research Foundation and also the other funding agency. I think that is one piece that needs to be looked into as well. So if the coordination is well thought and they are fairly independent and autonomous, I think it will definitely bolster our dreams, right? To bring in more innovation in this country. Think about our spend on R&D, right? Research and innovation. 2019, right? In 2019, we spent approximately 0.68% of our GDP on research and innovation in India, versus if you look at the US data, it's around 2.2-ish level. If you look at the Japanese data, it's around 4.2, 4.3 level of their GDP, right? So we have not invested in research and innovation as much as we should have, right? Now, given the thrust towards forming the National Research Foundation, I hope funding will be channelized, and this foundation would be able to guide universities in their research endeavor. And once this is done tactfully, strategically, and the moment we up our research rigor within the HEI space, we'll see Indian universities, in the global rankings, right? We keep talking about, we keep gloating about, the top institution, having a cutoff rate of 99% every year, having a 98% every year. But how many of them appear in the top global rankings, right? And if we don't appear in the top global rankings, we don't get the credibility that we should get, within this student fraternity. And henceforth, there is this huge talent rush out of India, right? So the moment we focus on research, right, and if this, the NRF is effective, will bolster our research aspiration, faculty will bring in cutting edge research in class, will create an entrepreneurial ecosystem that is full of innovation, right? So I think the lack of research, has prevented us from seeking global rankings, and this has also led to a talent flush out of India. And I definitely, applaud this initiative.
Yes, absolutely. 750,000 students who 750,000 students who leave India
Absolutely.
every year for higher
And
education.
mind you, they are at the helm of things in Canada, for example, in US, for example, right, in Europe, right? They are doing exceedingly well and contributing to those economies. Imagine if you could have retained that talent in India. Just think about it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Raghu, on the same subject, since you've been in, teaching in IIM Ahmedabad for so many years, and you've been in education for so many years, this same point which Dishan spoke about, what are your views?
Yeah, I entirely agree with Dishan. You see, in any case, if you have to collaborate also on research with the more advanced universities elsewhere, we have to up our level from where we are today. For instance, listen to this. About 13.4 lakhs patent applications are filed in China today, of which only 10% come from non-resident Chinese. In the US, about 6.05 lakh patents are filed every year, almost entirely by Americans. So 13.4 lakh in China and half of that in US. In India, we file about 45,000 patents a year, of which 70% are by non-resident Indians settled overseas. Okay, so 30% of 45, you are obviously talking about less than, between 12 and 15,000 patents being filed in India. Now, if we are going, it's going to be a horse and rabbits too, so to speak. If you want to, collaborate with the top American university or a top Canadian university, and where our best institutions are not in the top 100 yet, we have a lot of work to do, and this is a good beginning. This documentation makes a good beginning. But I am concerned about certain other things. You see, many of these things work if this policy document took some of the earlier thrust in the same direction. But I remember UGC 2 years ago sending out a circular, because I was chairing a large engineering college and I've seen it myself, that publications are not a requirement for promotions anymore. How on earth do you put this policy consistent with what was announced by UGC 2 years ago? So if the country is doing different things every year, suddenly somebody is very bright who's putting the document together, says something which is theoretically the right thing to say. But 2 years ago, your own UGC, the country's main regulatory body of all the universities, says research is not required for promotion. I am completely confused for one. So I really do not know, what to expect on the ground. But yes, to the extent that we need to make a beginning and the will has been announced to be existent at the highest level, is a greatly welcome measure.
Thank you, Raghu. So switching tracks a bit, if I can move to Barry, especially over the last couple of months, how is technology shaping education, especially, and how will it shape education post-COVID? And do you think it can sort of provide more flexibility and learning support than the usual traditional formats?
Well, Ron, too, this is something I think about a lot, and I think a lot of educational leaders think about a lot. I think it's a two-edged sword. Many commentators have said that they've seen more change in 4 months in North American universities than they would normally see in 10 years. And a lot of this was forced upon universities by necessity. For many university leaders, they're counting the days till they can go back to normal. Others see this as an opportunity to take some of the transformation that's been forced upon us and see if they can make it more permanent. Having said that, there are other stakeholders involved. For example, the National Faculty Association in Canada, a union, who is very concerned that universities will take advantage of this temporary situation to do things which are financially advantageous to universities, but the union see as disadvantageous to the faculty. So I think the smart thing to do is to look down the road, see what opportunities can be created, and that's certainly what we're doing from this. One thing that we're waiting to see is in 2 weeks' time, will all of the Indian students, for example, who have registered to study at our university this fall, and we will be entirely online as an undergraduate institution, whether in fact they all do show up, pay tuition, and register. There are two things militating in two different directions on this. One is that many students in North America believe that online education is not as good as in person. And I've got a lot of sympathy for that. The sense of community and accidental interchange of information. You learn as much in my experience as you do in the classroom. And that doesn't happen as much when you're all on Zoom. On the other hand, we have a couple of thousand students who have been cooped up for several months, some cases their parents' basement, and their life has been on hold, and they want to get the show on the road again and get involved in education. So rather than saying, yeah, in January or next September, we'll go back to normal, I think this is a real opportunity for me to say, what can I do now, having seen what's possible? If everything's completely changed, what can I do that can make this a stronger institution and offer a deeper educational experience for students? I do want to be back on person in campus, but I think now we see that we can extend our reach in ways that before we didn't see as possible. So let's use this as a creative moment, not just as a pause and a period of frustration.
Right. Dishan, how are you guys going to look at it going forward?
Well, as Barry mentioned, honestly, I think all of us have been forced to get into, to embrace technology 100%, right? And while embracing technology, we've realized the silver lining as well. It allowed us to think about innovative ways to, deliver programs using a blended model. So while we were all forced to, improvise, I think as for me, I think blended is the way going forward, right? I think given that all of us have experimented, faculty, you have divide within faculty as well. You have the younger faculty who can embrace technology, in a jiffy as well. And you have this, group of senior faculty who would never want to, even punch a button in the machine and learn Zoom, right? But this has forced everyone to be the masters of all platforms now, right? And they realize that, it's not that bad after all, right? So I think this has allowed us to, innovate further the pedagogies that we've been using. And definitely it's going to be, blended going forward. But, given postgrad and undergrad education and the sense of purpose are very, very different for both these sets of students, right? I do see, so the proportion of remote delivery embraced in our curriculum in the undergrad versus postgrad would be very different, right? I see more uptake of online and blended in the postgrad space, right? And obviously in an undergrad space where you are, I think the interaction, the group discussion, the entire campus experience that allows students to not only hone their IQ, right? But their EQ as well, right? Their social quotient, right? Environment quotient, cultural quotient, right? I think that requires students to be in campus. A lot of learning happens outside class via interaction. So so the uptick on blended would be far less in undergrad than in postgrad. But this has definitely allowed us to leverage technology and will continue to do so.
So before we move on to some set of audience, one or two questions, couple of questions, I just wanted to ask Raghu, so will these policy reforms in higher education produce something which Nishant touched on, employable graduates and capable researchers? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a no-brainer to say that if it's implemented as it should be, what he says should happen. Maybe not next year, not the year after, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because we already, be careful, we already have a full generation of youth sitting over there who are ill-educated in government schools, which delivered very little. The foundations were weak. Then they went to colleges where probably often the degrees were not worth the paper they were printed on. So you have a whole generation of youth sitting there which is unemployable. And now for us to redo the entire game and start from scratch and really do something amazing, it's bound to take time. Minimum of 5 to 7 years is how I look at it. But if done right, if all the pieces fall in place, and if we diligently implement it without let, India will certainly see or reap the benefits 5 to 7 years from now. But if it is again one beautiful document and then it's all, once the immediate brouhaha about the new NEP is over and it's all back to normal, especially for instance, if the regulatory quality does not change in the academic area. For example, many of our academic bodies have not been the role models for what academic regulation should be. We know of a certain chairman of regulatory agencies in academia who went to jail for graft and so on. We know NCI, the medical regulators, what their reputation in the country has been. So unless we improve regulators and make them accountable. Today, regulators are not accountable. Who holds UGC accountable for whatever education plight is? Who holds AICTE responsible for the quality of the engineering colleges that we may or may not have? So I think we need to do a lot other pieces simultaneously. And if we do that in 5 to 7 years time frame, we will see the benefit.
Dontu, if I can just add on, right? Raghu, you talked about unemployability currently, right? And we talk about the demographic dividend.
Yeah.
10 years down the road, we will have 170 crore college goers in our country.
Correct.
Right? If this is the state today, imagine 10 years down the road.
It's a demographic disaster in that case.
Absolutely, unless we have to implement this wonderful policy.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
it's a great opportunity, and we have we cannot miss the bus this time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Moving very quickly to Barry, you may have read in the NEP's goals to inculcate critical thinking, widening subject choices, blurring the rigid separation between arts and science streams. So all this seems to bode well for Indian education. So coming from Canada and you have and North America such great liberal arts schools, what are your thoughts as an outsider looking in?
Well, this has been a great irony for the last 5 or 6 years for me as I travel across the country and around the world banging the drum for liberal education as an evangelist, to watch North American universities flee from liberal education. And so liberal arts enrollment in North America has declined about 40% in the last decade, and particularly in humanities, social sciences, and even the natural sciences. And so I'm so frustrated and discouraged on the one hand there, because I know the importance of this kind of education. So I'm heartened when I look at other parts of the world, whether it's in Singapore or in China or in Japan, and now in India, to see, led by institutions like Flame, a rebirth of the value of this kind of education. So that part is tremendously encouraging for me. Something I wanted to mention that we should keep an eye on all this, and we've touched on it once or twice, and just this question right now about employment, is the equity and access side of this. And a friend texted me just a moment ago as we were discussing this. So we have students, for example, we sponsor our university who live in refugee camps in Africa. And initially we thought, okay, this will be a bit easier, this current COVID situation. They won't have to travel, incur the expenses. We can help them out and in fact expand the number of students we're helping. Until 2 weeks ago, when my wife was on a Zoom with a group of students, including one of our refugee students in Africa. Well, they're not sitting in a comfortable home with the latest Apple technology, with high-speed internet, and he couldn't even get on the call. And so whichever way we're going to emerge after this, the complexity of access in one direction seem to be alleviated, but in another direction they're exacerbated. And if we're going to be serious about access to people from all socioeconomic strata, we have to be thinking about the consequences even in the hybrid model of how we can have equal access to this form of education. And so I will come back to my original point, thing I said at the very beginning. I think liberal education is vital to the maintenance of a liberal democratic society. But all the way along, we have to keep in mind that people have different degrees of ability to participate. And if we're going to be serious about this, we have to find ways to make this participation equal. And the very best universities are not always accessible. We see this in the United States. They cost 10 or 20 times the cost of universities that aren't as good. And if we want equal access to the top tier of education, it will take money. And that's something we have to be serious about.
A quick comment from you on this, Dishan.
Well, I totally agree. I totally agree. And again, when you talk about blended model going forward, you have the private universities and the public universities. While at present it may not be a great challenge for the private universities, but how do we reach out to the second tier and third tier, students who may not have access to technology, right? So definitely a conscious effort has to be put in by universities in ensuring that connectivity and the basic infrastructure is made available before we plan on such official curricula. Absolutely.
Actually, Dishan, the NEP itself provides for, it specifically refers to digital libraries, digital contents, digital pedagogy and classrooms, online teaching elements, which are all, of course, triggered by the COVID. But as Barry was earlier saying, even in the absence of COVID or after COVID, if we can make use of these more effectively, I think we could thank COVID looking back, saying that it advanced the use of technology in education by at least a decade or maybe a couple of decades, So I also think this will help increase maybe the bandwidth issues that we face in India, the Wi-Fi issues that we face in India and the smaller towns and so on. Hopefully everything will rise along with the need. Sometimes demand chases supply, sometimes supply chases demand. So I think we'll see some of that effect over here.
Yeah, and Raghu, basic infrastructure needs to be available to all students.
Absolutely.
Right? Otherwise, you have the MOOCs, you have all the platforms available by the government, and end of the day, the NEP should it has vision to providing high quality education across the country.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think it's a balance, and like you said, we need to move ahead in parallel where industry also has a role to play.
Yes.
Absolutely. If I can now quickly move on to one or two questions. So there's a question from Archana Krishnamurthy, founder director of the Conscious Living Center. So she says we work with education institutions to co-create a conscious education ecosystem and work with individuals like students, parents, etc. Question is, what could be one of the most effective ways to encourage collaboration in creating an education ecosystem where various organizations and individuals in the community from across the globe can participate in creating the next gen leaders. Would love to hear one idea each from each one of our panelists. So should I start with you, Barry?
Oh, I was so hoping you would start with one of the smart people. I think you have to get people involved that know about the system. I can tell a story of one jurisdiction in Canada that will go unnamed, where 3 consecutive ministers of post-secondary education had not themselves ever experienced post-secondary education. And so that was a challenge for us to get people who know about engagement of students involved in the making of policy. And that's always going to be the conscious tension in any democratic society between the political goals of any particular government and what they believe are achievable with respect to their political ends, which will vary from country to country, and what people understand pedagogy know are effective, in many cases, which are applicable across all countries. And whether we can get national governments and provincial and state governments to be able to listen to the things that work and make the commitment to implement them when they have to make a number of political calculations and trade-offs themselves. And that's why many beautiful visionary ideas that are put forward after consultations with panels of experts don't come to fruition because they die in the process of political calculus. And so when you talk about doing it globally, it's amplified by 200 times as many states are involved. To do it locally, at a state level, and at a federal level, every single level you move up, it becomes more challenging to implement the vision that people who understand education know will work. And so, can we do this? The vision in this document is that you have an overarching agency that makes sure everybody marches in tune to this vision. We'll see, as Raghu has pointed out and suggested, whether that can actually be followed through with the kind of commitment in a direct way. So I encourage the optimism of that question, but we should never neglect the real challenges of watching these things get implemented.
Thanks. In the interest of time, maybe I'll jump to another question. This is to Dishan. Rajika Anandas, the panelist views, I guess Dishan, you'd be the most qualified, about the proposal to have a 4-year undergrad program at Indian universities. Do they foresee it succeeding?
Well, I first of all, I would like to comment on the government's new policy of allowing students to exit at every level, right? So this gives, based on the policy, a student is able to, exit after the first year and be certified with some vocational certificate, right? If you continue 2 years, then probably you get a diploma, right? If you continue 3 years, you'll get a degree, right? And, if you would like to take a capstone project on research, and if you would, if you wish to pursue, an academic profession or some super specialization, add on a 4th year in a research-driven curriculum, and then fulfill your aspirations of super specialization. But in my view, a 4-year undergrad program is definitely desirable. But the challenge here is the government is mandating exit options. Now the big question is, can we offer a 4-year program without mandating an exit? Right? I think that's the challenge. I mean, I would jump on that opportunity and revise our entire curriculum at Flame and offer a 4-year, undergrad program in liberal education. But but if we, so again, it's not very clear, the entire national education policy, what we can do, what we can't do. My sense is, if given a choice, I would start a 4-year program, hands down, right? Because there's so much that you can do in 4 years. There's so much you can impart to the holistic development of a student. But now starting a 4-year program and forcing me to allow students to exit in 1st year, 2nd and 3rd year, then there leaves no option but to offer a 4th year, fully research-based super specialization for students who want either to enhance their knowledge on a minor, right, and make that a major, so they can graduate a double major, or dive deeper into their area of expertise. So we are pretty unclear, but I hope that my sense is very well elucidated.
So quickly moving to another question, Raghu. Anil Kamath is asking that the discussion we've had is generally revolved around university level education. And he feels that the current bane of the state of education in India starts right from the relevance of pedagogy and content at the primary level. So secondary and then higher education become derivatives of the deep change in the primary level. So he wants a comment on.
No, I think that's an absolutely valid point, because we are all higher institutions people. We've been focusing, I mean, as a thematic thing for this conference, we were looking at higher education, but his question is very valid. And yes, because in fact, 80% of the NEP itself revolves around the primary education policy, not so much on the secondary education policy. But the whole problem there is one thing that they have not addressed there is, though tangentially it is addressed, they're talking about accountability of the government school system by segregating regulators from the administrators. That statement exists in the NEP for schooling. Because the Indian problem is 43-45% of the education is delivered by the government schools. And government schools have historically not delivered. Let us face it. For 75 years in India, education was not the top priority. Suddenly this NEP is coming and putting everything upside down on the head and saying that education will be the foundation for the entire economy. So it is going to be a huge challenge to make the government school system deliver. So there are philosophical questions. Should you fund the government schools in order to deliver? Or should you fund the parents of the children going to school so that they can choose whether they will go to private schools or to the public schools or the government schools? So why not give the choice to the people? So that would make the government schools compete with the private schools, or else close down. But closing down schools is never an option for government, because the school teachers are the electoral officers. Every 5 years that elections happen. So you have a very complex situation on the primary market side, on the primary education side, where it's going to be a very, very difficult thing. And the NEP does not address how to make the existing brick and mortar of the government school system deliver. How do you make the government school teacher accountable? In fact, I had once gone to the HRD minister saying, I will take over 500 government schools. I only want one thing, the right to hire and fire teachers. The answer was blanket no. Except that, ask for anything. And I had said we will spend 10 lakh on every school every year for the next 5 years. That was a capex commitment. But even that was not acceptable to the government. So I don't know how this NEP will address that issue. But it remains to be seen how, I'm sure, government will want to work around some of these challenges. That's why they have talked about segregating the regulators from the administrators, which is one step forward. So let us hope for the best.
Very quickly, we're coming to the last 2-3 minutes. Just picking up from your point, there is a bias against for-profit education.
Bias against?
For-profit education
For-profit.
in the higher education space. Whereas I think if I read the NEP document correctly, it does not apply at the primary level. You can still have private institutions. So is that bias a self-goal in a way? If you're looking at...
In India, these biases had very little meaning. Even in schools, they always separated education from infrastructure. Infrastructure was for profit. And the schools were renting out that building and saying we are only paying a rental. So the fee was capturing the rentals, which was the profit-making arm of the education delivery, even though schools were not supposed to be for profit. So I think in this day and age, government doesn't need to worry about whether it's for profit or not. People are intelligent. They know when they're getting value for money. And if they can pay 45-50 lakh per year for American or Canadian education, why should they not pay, half that for someone who's for profit in India, but is giving you 75% of that quality? So I would like to see the government slowly disengaging itself. If hospital health can be for profit, I don't see why education cannot be for profit. But yes, primary education should primarily have a governmental focus, because of a country like India where 60% people make less than $2 a day. That may be non-negotiable, but make the government school systems deliver well, make the poor people keep their children in government schools because they deliver, rather than taking them to private schools which take them for a ride. I think that is where the government has to work very hard. In higher education, they can, for profit or not for profit really means nothing. Indian entrepreneurs are very imaginative.
So very quickly, Barry, just a quick comment on this for-profit, non-profit education. And then we sort of close this panel. I mean, we could go on and on by brief closing remarks where I'll start with Barry, where I'd ask him to rate the policy document on a scale of 1 to 10. And probably if he has any one issue he feels that this policy could have addressed, which is not in the document. And I'd like to go around to Raghu and Dishan and close in that fashion.
Yeah, I would give the policy a 5 out of 5 as a policy, with a big asterisk on the side, which is Raghu's point that in 20 years' time, we could see it as a 0 out of 5. And so the difference will be the implementation and the follow-through. The vision itself, I think, is superb. It's a great vision for a differentiated and modernized educational system that raises its standards, that helps prevent the brain drain, yet is open to engaging with the international community. All of that, I think, is a positive. How you get there and whether you have the strength of will and consistency at the political level to follow through on this, that will tell the difference. The old saying is that there's many a slip between the cup and the lip, and that will apply in this case.
Yeah. Sure.
Yes, as I said, Ronto, I think it's a brilliant policy. It's a brilliant policy. And just timelines and process for implementation, it's not clear at all, right? A lot of things are still vague. I think the devil in the detail, right? So henceforth, we just wait for more clarity, and if the process and timelines are to the T, I think India has a very bright future.
Raghu?
My answer is contained as an answer to the question asked by Ilyas Nazir, who says, is there an accountability system with the policy to be implemented, irrespective of which government is in power? I think that's a very good point. We are looking at 20 years ahead, from 2020 to 2040. Any government could come in and out of power during that period. And education in India, as Barry was saying, in Canada, is a state subject. How is the central going to implement the policy across 28 states and so on is a huge challenge. And this is something which the document does not actually address. It does not say who is going to be accountable, or which body, which institutionalized framework will be responsible for which part of the accountability of the policy. I think that's a weak spot, if at all one has to critique it.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think it was a wonderful discussion, lots of debate and lots of different ideas. And I think everyone agrees that NEP is a very forward-looking document, and the devil lies in the implementation. So let's hope that it succeeds, and we all wish that it succeeds. Thank you again.
Thank you, Rontu. Great job. Great, Dishan. Great, Barry, meeting you both. And thank you to all our audience who've been there.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.